Thank you. And welcome to the first ever episode of the Big Book Club. Yes, books are back on telly. Every week I'll be travelling to a different bit of Scotland to bring you the world's best loved and best selling writers. I'll be bringing you novelists, I'll be bringing you non-fiction writers, I'll be bringing you poets. Don't look scared about the poetry. There'll be none of that kind of poetry listening face that you had to do at school. We're way past that. Our poets are incredible. Tonight we're in the fantastic Inchira Arts Club here in Perthshire, and every week I will be travelling to a different book club. I had the pleasure recently of going to Cooper for the very first time and meeting the ladies of Walk On. They've got their t-shirts on over there, very on brand ladies. I got to hear what they had to say about Ian Rankin, and more of that in a wee bit. They were quite hot for Rankin. Or Rebus. I couldn't work it out. There was definitely some passion there. Every week we'll be going deep on a theme. Here in Scotland it would be impossible to do anything other than tartan noir, than crime. The misdeeds that we're talking about tonight range from a lost book, a stolen book, to a stolen soul. And very often the people who are tracking down the bad guys seem as bad as the bad guys themselves. So to our guests, and they are amazing. Ambrose Parry, a.k.a. Chris Brookmeyer and Marissa Hakesman. Debut writer Sara Collins. Wraith Rovers superfan, some say only fan, Ian Rankin. And our poet is Richard Scott. First guest first. The Way of All Flesh takes us to 1840s Edinburgh, where the shiny new town rubs up against the mucky old town. Both halves of this conflicted city are personified in Will Raven, a medical student with secrets. Now, he has to team up with Sarah Fisher, a housemaid who has got ideas above her station to solve a series of grisly murders, and they are grisly. To welcome us to the city of medicine, murder and money, please welcome both halves of Ambrose Parry. Before we talk about the book, you're going to read a wee bit for us. I happen to have a copy here of The Way of All Flesh. Chris?
A gust of wind whipped about Raven as he crossed the North Bridge, causing him to reach up with one hand to secure his hat. Its sting made the warmth of August seem a memory of a forgotten age, and within it he felt the harsh and certain promise of winter. There were other promises in that wind, however. The blast was cold but fresh, blowing away the pervasive reek that had surrounded him these past years. Here on the other side of the bridge lay quite another Edinburgh. He turned onto Princes Street and past Duncan and Flockhart's, where he caught sight of himself in the druggist's window. In the glass he was reminded that though the old town stink could be blown away, its mark would be upon him for life. The left side of his face was swollen and bruised, the stitches sitting up prominently along the contused curve of his cheek. Beneath his hat, his hair was sticking out at odd angles, matted together in places with dried blood. When he arrived at Queen Street, Dr. Simpson was as likely to send him a bed as a patient as to welcome him into his practice. The pavement was broader here, the crowds thinner. The people he passed were straight-backed and assured in their gait, strolling in a manner that was purposeful and yet unhurried, as they browsed the shop fronts. By contrast, the old town was a hill of ants, its inhabitants bowed and scuttling as they hastened about its twisted byways. Even the road seemed to lack the mud and ordure that piled up relentlessly within the narrow alleyways of the Canongate. As he turned onto Queen Street, a brougham carriage drawn by two lively steeds pulled to a halt just ahead, prompting Raven to wonder absently if the coachman had trained his beasts to void themselves only in the poorer parts of town.
That's Edinburgh as it's so often represented in fiction. You know, a city of two halves, basically all fur coat and no knickers. That has always been, hasn't it? That's how it seems to come across in literature. It's rarely one place, is it?
One of the things that's striking about it at that time is this contrast, which you can see today, the labyrinthine old town and the geometric new town. But at this time, what's fascinating to us about it was that this is another contrast, is that at the time you could have argued that Edinburgh was at the absolute kind of cutting edge of contemporary modernity, particularly in the advances in medicine. but that's cheek by jowl with the worst squalor, the worst poverty. And what attracted us to the entire project was that James Young Simpson transcends all these strata of Edinburgh society.
And where does Ambrose Parry come from, the name?
It's a little kind of historical reference in that Ambrose Parry was a French military surgeon in the 16th century who wrote a lot about obstetrics. And his name was mentioned in one of the first tutorials I attended when I was doing my degree, and it kind of stuck with me. And Ambrose Parry was probably one of the first things we agreed on when we were thinking about the book.
I like the way you said first as in only thing we agreed in when we started writing on the book there. That was a very good silence. I like that. So Marissa, James Young Simpson's discovery, or rather the discovery of him was you came across him when you were doing your masters, right?
Yes, I did a masters in the history of medicine, and being an anaesthetist by trade, I decided to look at the early use of ether and chloroform in the maternity hospital in Edinburgh, and Simpson's name crops up because he discovered the anaesthetic properties of chloroform, and it kind of started from there. It snowballed because Simpson himself is such a fascinating character. He was very warm and humanitarian, but also very mischievous, and there was lots of controversy in his life and lots of tragedy, so he was a great dramatic persona to kind of to write about.
I couldn't believe it when I read in the novel about the discovery of chloroform. It seemed so incredibly risky and also quite fun, the way they were sitting around smelling all these basically buzzing glue at their fancy dinner table in the new town. Is that what it was really like?
Yeah, there are several descriptions, but probably the best known description was written by their next door neighbour, who happened to be the professor of surgery, who usually popped in first thing in the morning to make sure they had survived the experiments from the night before. So they were doing it quite regularly.
Right.
But there was one night they had sniffed everything that they had managed to acquire from the chemistry department, and nothing was working. And they found this specimen tucked at the back of the cupboard and sat down and sniffed it. And in Simpson's own words, were under the mahogany in a thrice and realised they had discovered what they had been looking for.
Amazing. That is a fantastic scene. Of course, in the novel, you use it for more nefarious purposes. Tell us how it is that you two started writing together, because for a very long time, quite happily, you'd been doctoring and anaesthetising people, and you'd been at home writing. How was it that you came to start working together?
I think really it was, I took a year out to do a history degree, started reading about James Young Simpson, started talking to Chris about it. And at some point during one of these discussions, Chris said, "I think there's a book in this," which I thought was just a frivolous comment. But then the more we talked about it, the more we thought this was a good idea.
But why did you not just write it on your own?
Well, that's probably the salient point, is we talked about how Marissa could research all of this, and I could write something, and then we realised that really wasn't practical, that she couldn't go off and compile some massive dossier of information and then expect me to construct a narrative from it. That I think what makes Ambrose Parry, the chemistry of it, is that Marissa has a perspective upon all of this, not only from having studied the history of it, but from having walked the walk. So there was things that she saw in the research as an anaesthetist and as a doctor that no one else would have spotted, drama that someone else wouldn't have realised existed in certain conflicts. So really it had to be the two of us together, and in the way we've worked together just has had to evolve, but it became clear that it was something we would have to do back and forth. We'd have to develop the ideas between ourselves.
And how has it evolved? Because you, when you're writing on your own, have tended to go out, I know, and talk into a dictaphone, sort of like a mad person in the street in all days and nights and all weathers, and you're used to quite an orderly environment where everything has to happen in particular ways. So where do you meet?
We meet in the kitchen. Because really, it's around the kitchen tables where the whole thing was conceived. And we'll sit there and knock ideas back and forth and gradually develop where we want the story to go. But then we will go off to separate rooms to write.
Right.
We don't ever sit at the computer together, because I think that would see the end of not only the next novel, but probably our marriage.
That sounds wise. This is obviously very many years before the founding of the NHS. I mean, you can get healthcare if you can pay for it. If you can't, you're kind of stuck. It struck me as very brutal.
Yes, I think it absolutely was. And I think that was one of the fascinating things for me. I think, well, what I hoped would happen is that an understanding and appreciation of how far we've come in a relatively short period of time. If people get that from the book, I'd be delighted, because it was brutal. Before anaesthetics, there was limited surgery done, and the surgery that was done without any form of pain relief and just as quickly as possible. And the limitations on what doctors could do were just enormous.
It really brought home to me the origins of the term operating theatre,
Yeah.
where all these men are standing around in this space looking down at a surgeon who's picking up a saw quite dramatically and moving it towards a limb. I mean, it was really quite hard to read.
Yeah.
At points. Was it hard to write? And does that mean that was gruesome? Were you a bit like, oh, I've got the book, I have to go back to it, you know?
I think some of the obstetric scenes were quite hard to write, because some of the procedures described in the book are absolutely not done now.
Like the craniotomy?
Yes, yes.
Can you explain what that is for people?
Well, this is in a time before caesarean section operations were carried out. And also a time of rickets, where there was often a difficulty in delivering a sizable child through a very narrowed pelvis. So there was no way of delivering the child. So sometimes the child the infant was usually dead when they did this, but sometimes they had to break down the head in order to deliver the baby. And this is true, this is what happened. And the descriptions in the book, all the medical cases, are from case books or textbook descriptions of what happened.
So every single one of those is real?
Yes.
Oh, that's
yes.
even worse.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of authentically reflect what it was like.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not like you also needed fiction. Reality was terrifying enough at that point.
It was.
I understand that, so it's a trilogy. The second one is out now,
Yes.
The Art of Dying. The third one?
Well, Marissa's thinking about the storyline and the themes and where we're going to take the characters while I work on my next solo book. That's the great thing about Ambrose Parry, is I can be doing something else and the next Ambrose Parry's getting written.
Ambrose Parry's cracking on while Chris Brookmeyer's doing it. So you in the kitchen and he's upstairs, or have you worked out the space? Sharing the desk?
We both have our own spaces, don't we?
And have you given up medicine now?
For the time being, yes. The writing has taken up so much time, writing and promoting, that I haven't actually given anaesthetic for a couple of years.
Okay, you've not been tempted to anaesthetise him at any point during the writing process?
No, I think it might be the other way around.
But what was it like for you starting out as a writer? Because I mean, that's, you know, a terrifying. When I sit down to write, I'm just, you know, there's so much going on for me, but that's what I've got to do. It's my job. It's what I've chosen. It's what I've always wanted to do. You've had a whole career before you've got to this. Did you feel intimidated, nervous? What did you feel?
Oh, hugely intimidated, because I've known Chris for a really long time, and I know how much is involved in writing a novel. I know what a huge commitment it is. So I was hugely intimidated. And I don't think, I honestly couldn't have worked with anyone else, because when you're starting off and you don't know if it's any good, it's very difficult to show it to anyone. And I don't think there's anyone else that I would have shared my early writings with.
And how did that go with the sharing? But as a writer, I mean, are you able to just sort of say, like, right, this is working, this is not working? Quite hard to separate the writer and husband roles out, I think.
I think one of the reasons this whole thing came about was that it was a means of taking the things we were doing in our spare time and making it our job.
Right.
You know, the reason we were inspired to write it was we'd sit there and talk about what Marissa was discovering about James Young Simpson regularly, because she'd keep telling me these wee anecdotes or these wee nuggets, and I think, God, that's amazing, that would make a great scene in a book. And at one point I said to her, look, not only that we should write this, but I said, I can't believe nobody's beaten us to it.
Yeah. It's very, very, very visual, to the point sometimes where when I'm reading it, I'm like that, oh my God, please just stop the go. But it must be being made into a film or telly-series, surely.
Yeah, we've they sold the option to Sunny March, which is Benedict Cumberbatch's company. And they're developing it in conjunction with Sky Atlantic. You know, we've sort of tossed around dream casting, and we decided that we quite liked the notion of Jack Lowden as Raven.
Oh, right.
That's just our suggestion. Although we did tell Jack Lowden, he seemed quite pleased.
I look forward to that for so many reasons. I really do hope that you get Jack Loudon in it. Please join me in thanking both halves of Ambrose Parry. Now, I want you to meet Frannie Langton, the mulatto murderess. Fran stands accused of stabbing to death her master and mistress on the 27th day of January in the year of our Lord, 1826. Did she do it? Will she face the gallows? The only person who knows is her creator. That's the author of The Confessions of Frannie Langton. Please welcome Sara Collins. Before we meet Frannie, can we hear a wee bit from the woman herself?
My trial starts the way my life did, a squall of elbows and shoving and spit. From the prisoner's hold, they take me through the gallery, down the stairs, and past the table crawling with barristers and clerks. Around me, a river of faces in flood, their mutters rising, blending with the lawyer's whispers. A noise that hums with all the spite of bees in a bush. Heads turn as I enter, every eye a skewer. I duck my head, pare at my boots, grip my hands to stop their awful trembling. It seems all of London is here, but then murder is the story this city likes best. All of them swollen into the same mood, all of them in a stir about the sensation excited by these most ferocious murders. Those were the words of the Morning Chronicle, itself in the business of harvesting that very sensation like an ink-black crop. I don't make a habit of reading what the broadsheets say about me, for newspapers are like a mirror I saw once in a fair near the Strand that stretched my reflection like a rack, gave me two heads, so I almost didn't know myself. If you've ever had the misfortune to be written about, you know what I mean. But there are turnkeys at Newgate who read them at you for sport. Precious little you can do to get away. When they see I'm not moving, they shove me forward with the flats of their hands, and I shiver despite the heat, fumble my way down the steps. Murderer. The word follows me. Murderer. The mulatta murderess.
And she gets called all kinds of names in this novel, doesn't she? At one point, she briefly works in a brothel. What's her name there? Ebony Fran.
Ebony Fran. Yeah.
She goes by many names. She's in London now, but she starts life in Paradise in Jamaica, which is anything but. Tell us about that place.
Yeah, so Paradise is ironically named because, as you say, it's anything but. And in fact, much like I did, Frannie really spends all of her time there trying to get away from it. So it's a plantation in Montego Bay run by an awful figure, John Langton, who has everyone on the plantation under his thumb. And he sort of involves Frannie in his very misguided and incredibly off-putting scientific experimentation. But what Frannie really wants, and this came from me thinking about what I would have lost had I been whisked back to this particular period in history by time machine. What is it that I would have missed? What would have been taken away from me that would have meant the most to me? And with apologies to my family, it really was books and learning. And I got this very strong image of a young girl growing up on a plantation, looking through the window of this great house at the books and the library and wanting that for herself. And the question then became, how far would she go to get it? Tragedy strikes the plantation, and Frannie's brought by her owner, John Langton, to London, and she's given as a gift to a famous natural philosopher.
Just say that again. She's given as a gift.
She's given as a gift. And one of the things about Georgian London, which I was fascinated about when I wrote this novel, was the hypocrisy, this sort of self-congratulatory air of progress and, the age of the Enlightenment. But beneath that, there was this underbelly. There was a refusal to recognize that all of this wonderful luxury was being built on the backs of people who had been enslaved. But then Frannie has an adventure in London. It was very important for me that she would be the star of what I consider a kind of classic Gothic romance. So she, in the household in Mayfair, where she's given as a gift, she meets her master's wife, who is an enigmatic, perpetually dissatisfied Frenchwoman, and she's instantly attracted to her, because who wouldn't be?
Yes, Marguerite.
Frenchwoman. And they have a very passionate affair.
Yes, that's where it basically is like the black lesbian Jane Eyre aspect of it essentially kicks in at that point. And I tell you what, if you think I'm hot on this stage, reading that book, it makes Sarah Waters look tame.
Really?
Yes.
Can I quote you on that?
Yes, you can. You can slap that on the cover of the next one. No, but it really is saucy. I want to go back to her love of books, because really that's what drives her through the narrative, because she's telling us her own story, as you say, as Frannie says. Nobody in history who's like me has ever told their story. But you also say reading is the best thing and the worst thing to happen to Frannie. And I wanted to talk about the kind of the curse of learning, in a way, or where learning puts her, where she wouldn't otherwise have gone.
Yeah, I think there was a little seed of something autobiographical about that, because it's felt like that for me as a black woman who grew up as an obsessive bookworm. I mean, I loved books more than I loved anything else, and Jane Eyre being one of the books I love the most. I like to think of Frannie as kind of adding a little twist to Gothic romance by having the Jane Eyre figure have a twisted affair with a madwoman in the attic and then be accused of murdering Mr. Rochester, which is a fate I think Mr. Rochester deserved. But what I was really interested in is this idea that something you love, the world of Western literature in particular, can feel so much like it's excluding someone like me, and the effect that would have had.
When did you feel that for the first time? You said in the introduction to the book you realised that the books you loved didn't love you. When was that moment? I
remember having this feeling as a teenager that, first of all, there were hardly any black characters, and certainly not in historical fiction. And if you did encounter black characters in historical fiction, there were going to be slaves. What was always missing was the idea that they could have adventures, that there could be love stories, that there could be anger and passion. But also that there was this idea that in order to have a book published as a black writer, you had to be some kind of Nobel standard writer. The only black writers that I ever heard about were the greats, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, who should have had a Nobel Prize. And it seemed to me that one of the greatest tragedies that could befall a person is to have someone else in charge of telling you who you are, because books are such a big part of the way we shape our identities. And yet, people like me from the place I came from were never part of that conversation.
So you were a teenager when that happened?
Yeah, and I think I've been conscious of it all of my reading life.
Okay, and that informed your decision to write this particular story and put Frannie at the centre of it. But also, you were reluctant to write a slave story.
Yes.
So why did you?
I dragged myself to it kicking and screaming. I didn't want to write a slave story because I had a very strong sense that when people hear that a novel is about a person who's been enslaved or was formerly enslaved, they think they know exactly what it's going to be about. And the reaction usually is, oh, we've heard that story before. It's always the same story. And, that's focusing on what happened to people. These people who had to undergo that institution had such emergencies made of their lives that all of the talent and time and slim opportunities that they got to write anything had to be addressed to telling us how horrible it was. And that reduced every story down to the same story. I wasn't interested in that, but what I was interested in was figuring out whether we could do something different with it, whether Frannie could have a Gothic romance, whether she could be morally complicated, whether she could be the maid, the most intelligent person in the room. Yeah. And what would that look like? How angry would she be? And what would the result of that anger be?
The moral complexity is fascinating because, as you say, there is so much pressure because of that burden of representation to make those black characters good, morally good all the time. But Frannie is morally compromised right from the very start by things that happen in Paradise. Talk to us a wee bit about the experiments that she takes part in.
I think it was one of the things that surprised me the most about my research for the book, and there were some horrible things, was the extent to which the ideology that justified slavery was built on the ideas of the sort of great scientific thinkers of the age. And the extent to which those men, because they were all men, were so caught up in this project of proving scientifically that black people were not human beings. And so you have people who are now credited with essentially forming our notions of ourselves, who were experimenting with and keeping captive human specimens. Voltaire went to Paris and examined a little albino boy who was being held captive there, and, you know, reported back that, well, he looks a bit like a man because he has a face. And I just think, isn't it funny that we have decided of these men that genius was their preserve, and we don't question that assumption. But we do that only because they told us so.
Yeah.
And the real power is in who gets to leave the record behind, who gets to tell you that certain things should be accepted and certain things should not. And I wanted to address that, this idea that there is this coincidence between the people who tell the stories, the people who are free to love, the people who control the science, and what damage that's done throughout, you know, human life, essentially.
And you had the realisation as a teenager that, you know, you weren't in the stories that you were reading that you loved. You didn't immediately decide to become a writer, though. You became a lawyer. I
did. I was encouraged to do something sensible that would pay a mortgage, essentially.
Yes.
And apparently writing is not that. I was a lawyer instead for 17 years, which means I was miserable for 17 years because I wanted nothing more than to write books.
What kind of law were you doing?
So I was doing essentially litigation, going to court, families arguing over estates, which is good fodder for novels. Perhaps it will find its way into one. And then, you know, my husband and I had 5 children between us as a blended family, so I was also raising some children. And anyone who has children knows that their main role in the story of me getting this novel published was to grow up and start moving out of the house.
Yeah.
As soon as they did, I found I had time on my hands, didn't want to go back to law, which I'd given up when we blended our families to look after the children. And there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that if I didn't give it a shot, I was going to regret it. And I'm very glad I did.
And it has paid off. I mean, when you saw that tweet from Margaret Atwood saying that she loved the book.
I mean, I've had so many surreal experiences. I went and did a photo shoot with the Oprah magazine in New York, and, you know, I've been all over here. This is a surreal experience, but that nothing will top hearing the news that one of my literary heroes read and enjoyed the book. And the way I got the news was I was in the back of a taxi reading emails, and an email came in from my publisher with a screenshot of the tweet which said, Margaret Atwood has tweeted about the book. And I started composing a reply which said, guys, you're great, but this is the cruelest prank anyone has ever played on me, because I honestly couldn't believe it. And I had to then go to Twitter and verify it myself before I would believe it.
Massive fangirling.
I will never forget that moment.
So you couldn't have imagined it would have gone as well as it has?
Absolutely not. No. Not in a million years.
How do you follow up? What are you doing next?
Well, so Frannie's being adapted for television. And I made the mistake of saying yes to adapting. So I'm writing the scripts myself, which has been a real learning curve.
That's quite hard.
And then even harder than that, I've set myself the task of writing a love story set in a suicide cult, which is my book too. I am an incredibly dark and twisted person.
You thought, well, it wasn't enough to be dealing with the slavery and the plantations and the sexual abuse in Georgian London and the murder. I know, I'm going to write about a suicide cult.
Can I tell you what I did to alleviate the misery of all of that? I included a Georgian spanking brothel, and that was my...
That must have been some fun research.
That was my favourite bit to research, and in fact has resulted in my favourite quote on tour when I got asked about this, and I said this, and in the interview they said, well, it was so authentic, and I said, I think I was a mistress in a Georgian spanking brothel in a former life. And then I left the interview, called up my publicist and said, not sure if I should have said that. She said, oh, you absolutely should have said that.
Oh no, it's a great scene. I actually wanted a whole novel about that whole section.
So did I.
It was brilliant.
Shall we co-write one?
Yes, let's do it together. No, but I did feel like it was a book that you'd had to cut a lot from. It did feel there were all these different directions that could have gone in, and none of them were boring, which is a thrill.
You know, Hilary Mantel says a novel is a triumph of deletion. I kept that in mind because there is a lot. You have to know so much and include so much that you almost forget it. It goes into the substrata, if you like. But it's there, it resonates, I think. And for me, the book only took shape when I began to chop those bits away.
And see what you had left.
And see what I had left. For example, one of the things I cut was an entire section written from Madame's point of view.
Oh, really?
Which then left her much more enigmatic and therefore much more, I hope, much more interesting.
Yes, yes. We don't want to see too much of her, into too much of her mystery. Well, I cannot wait for the next novel, and I cannot wait for the adaptation. Thank you for joining us tonight. Please join me in thanking Sara Collins. To our final novelist of the night, Ian Rankin. I grew up in Motherwell, so I know, I grew up in Motherwell, so Edinburgh seemed impossibly exotic to me as a child. I read about it in the novels of Muriel Spark and Robert Louis Stevenson, but it was really Rebus who brought it alive for me. Since he appeared just over 30 years ago, Rebus has been promoted, demoted, assaulted, nearly killed, finally retired, but he just never stops coming back. In A House of Lies is his 22nd outing, but before we meet his maker, I'm going to introduce you to the ladies of the Walk On book group in Cooper, who had quite a lot to say about Rankin and Rebus. So this is Cooper, and the local book group told me to meet them right here. I see no books, I see no people, but in all my years as a reader and a writer, I've learned never try and guess the ending. Maybe they'll turn up, maybe they won't. Hello.
Hi, Damien.
Hi.
I'm Andrea.
Nice to meet you, Andrea. Very nice to meet you all.
Hello.
It's a book group. Where are the books?
This is a walk-on group. Would you like to join us?
So we're going to walk and talk about books?
Yes, you have to do the walk before we get to the books.
OK, fine. I'll do that. I'm happy to do that.
All right. Well, we have to give you a high-vis vest.
OK.
Be part of the team.
Right, you think you're not going to lose a 6'4" man on the way? I need to have high vis to make me stand out extra, that's fine. And what does the high vis mean? Responsibility, power beyond my wildest dreams, what do I have to do?
We would like you to be the backstop
OK, controversial
and
word,
make
but
sure
yeah.
none of us get lost.
Right, OK, lead on. I'll be at the back. I'll count you, should go. The Walk On Book Club in Cooper are unique in that anyone who wants to join must do the walk before they get to do the talk about the books. It might seem a little odd, but for these ladies, it seems to be working. And so is the book group a big part of your kind of social life here?
Well, as soon as I heard about it starting, I thought that's really good. One, because you get a walk, but then you also get a chance to sort of chat over the books.
So you get a theme?
Yeah.
And there's more than one book?
There's more than one book.
OK.
And then afterwards you can choose to read them if you want to.
Right.
And it's really good.
Oh, so sort of
then,
try before you buy kind of deal?
Yeah, that's right.
OK. And so after our walk, we head to the local library where tea and biscuits pave the way for Rebus.
I've read one other Rebus book, and having read this one, I can't make up my mind whether Rebus is a good guy or a bad guy.
It's taking a little while to sort out all the characters because I've never read a Rebus before, so the whole genre and the whole idea for me is new, but I actually am enjoying it and I want to go on reading it and finish it.
I thought it was interesting seeing how the police force had changed over time and attitudes that people had, the homophobia, the sexism, the racism, that to them seemed shocking now. And, you know, and they were the ones doing it, you know, so they changed a lot.
I found that quite problematic. It was 2006, and I think if it had been the 90s, I would totally believed it, but I found it less believable because it was 2006.
Is that just because you're optimistic? You'd like to think the police didn't have those attitudes?
That would be nice.
Yeah, it would be
wouldn't
nice.
it?
If you had a chance to ask Ian Rankin a question either about this book or his other books, what would you ask?
Does he borrow real-life crime? I was trying to work out if I could recognise any of the criminals in this book.
You might ask Ian Rankin, do you steal crimes from other... Are you a thief? Well, I'm glad they found me because I've loved my day in Cooper, walking and talking boots. I loved my tea, but it's time for something a bit stronger, maybe at the Oxford, maybe with a certain Mr. Rebus.
Please welcome Ian Rankin. Cheers. You're just here for the beer.
As ever.
Now, before we get to the stories of the stories of the stories, the lies upon lies, houses upon houses, can you give us a wee bit from the start?
I will. Specs.
There you go.
Because, like the good inspector, I'm falling apart. So it starts off basically some kids playing in the woods, and one of them's been shoved down a deep gully. Somebody dumped a car, Jimmy called up to them. Cars get dumped all the time, Rick commented. Are you okay to climb out of there? But Jimmy ignored him. He was moving around the car, doing his best to uncover it. The windows were still intact, but covered in a mossy film. He tugged his sleeve over his hand and started wiping. The other boys looked at each other. Alan was the first to start scrambling down the gradient, Rick and Ginger following his lead. Anything worth taking? Alan inquired. Jimmy's face was pressed to the glass. He tried the driver's side door, but it was jammed. I think it's a Polo, Ginger muttered. Then to clarify, the car, it's a VW Polo. Rick was rubbing moss across his palms. The nettles got me, he complained. Alan had circled to the passenger side and yanked the door open. The hinges creaked to resistance. Looks empty, he said, climbing in. The key was in the ignition, so he turned it, but nothing happened. Deed, he announced. Somebody nicked it and dumped it, Ginger concluded, growing bored already and giving one wing a kick. Rick had unzipped his fly and was urinating against a clump of ferns. Pea's good for nettle stings, Alan informed him, receiving a single raised finger in response. Jimmy had gone to the back of the car and was pressing the release button for the boot. It opened an inch, then stuck. Help me out, he commanded Ginger. The pair of them flinching as the rear window shattered. They turned towards Rick, who had thrown the stone and was now grinning as he brushed dirt from his hands. Oh, let's get out of here, Rick said. Ginger was peering through the hole in the glass. Something in the back, he announced, waiting until the others had joined him. Looks like a skeleton, Alan offered. Oh, it must be a joke or something, Rick said. Doesn't it look real to me? Does it look real to you? What does a real one look like, Professor? Jimmy shot back. He was taking photos with his phone. The others dug out their phones so they could do the same. It's got hair, Ginger said. Hair in a shirt.
Oh. It's very stand by me, that bit, the boys.
Very stand by me, yeah, and at that point it could have been a stand by me type story about these kids and what that experience means to them later on. Literally, as I was writing that, that's what I thought the story might be. But at the end of that section, spoiler alert, one of them takes out his phone and phones the police.
Yeah.
So suddenly it's not their story anymore.
When you had the skeleton in the boot of the car, did you know whose skeleton it was?
I knew whose skeleton it was. Yeah, it was a private detective skeleton. I didn't know who killed him or why, but I knew it was a private detective who'd been investigating a case 10 years before and had gone missing. So it was originally a missing person case, and then suddenly his skeleton turns up. And so it's a live murder inquiry. Because you don't normally commit suicide by jumping into the back of your own car with handcuffs on.
Handcuffs on your feet as well.
Right, I know, just as a wee added, frisson. And then it's a live murder inquiry, so I've got a murder team and everything, and that's all fine. Siobhan Clark, who's my detective, is there as part of it. And then, of course, the guy's been missing 10 years. I think, well, who would have originally been involved in the missing person inquiry? And of course, if you're going to investigate the murder, you're going to wonder why the police originally 10 years ago didn't find the car with the body in it.
Yes.
Because they scoured the woodland. It was near where the guy had gone missing. So then I'll be looking back to see if any mistakes were made from the original inquiry team. So that's where Rebus comes in.
There are a remarkable number of loose ends to be tied up in this book, and I wonder if you, when you're writing, leave loose ends for yourself to tie up later, or if you go back and think, where can I insert a bit of story here?
No, it's pretty organic. It sort of comes along as I'm writing. That there's this, you know, what starts out for me is quite a simple story, quite a linear story. If you start introducing characters and subplots and personal lives, it gets more and more convoluted and more complex. And the fun is trying to tie that together. But I don't like to if I can, I don't like to tie up all the loose ends. I like a few loose ends straggling. Got me in trouble years ago. I wrote a novel called Let It Bleed, and at the end it was very loose at the end. You didn't find out what really happened. Rebus just walks into a government office with some information. And my American publisher said, oh no, you can't leave it there, buddy. Because they, like Scots, say buddy quite a lot. And they said,
in a Fife accent.
You know, I know, you need an extra chapter at the end to explain what happened when he walked through the door. So the American edition is an extra chapter.
Oh, does it?
Because they like closure. And I think closure is the one thing that sometimes lets down the crime novel. Because real life isn't as cut and dried as that.
Yeah, no, there are always loose ends. So let's talk more about this private investigator. Who was he? What kind of person was he? And who was he working for?
Well, he was investigating possible links between business people and organised crime. And there's a film studio involved, a nascent film studio making kind of cheap, sort of straight-to-video movies and stuff, horror movies. Zombies versus Braveheart. I had a lot of fun with that kind of, with the storylines for those. And it's based very loosely, very, very loosely on a true story. There was a private detective who was investigating alleged links between senior police officers and organised crime in London 30 years ago. And he was found hacked to death in a pub car park. And nobody's ever been brought to justice for that crime. And Private Eye, the magazine, keep bringing it back and talking about it. They won't let it die, they won't let it go. And that tiny wee thread from Private Eye got into my subconscious and it refused to leave. And I wanted to give that story a kind of closure that it was maybe never going to have in real life.
So a question for you from the ladies of the Walk On Book Club in Cooper about the real life crimes that you incorporate into the stories. Basically, what Maureen was saying was, do you steal crimes? Is the gist of it.
Do I steal crimes? No, but I do get a lot of my storylines from the news, from newspapers, magazines, stories that people tell me, things that have actually happened. Usually true stories that don't have an ending. And so I try and give some closure in fiction in a way that isn't going to happen in real life. I mean, in A House of Lies, there are two basic strands to that. One is this dysfunctional family and the home life, the house that they live in. Another one is that in Edinburgh, the main police headquarters used to be called the Big House. And of course, there's a lot of dysfunctional stuff happening in a police headquarters. And all the cops involved in the original missing persons case are basically lying to the world and to each other and to themselves.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot. When I got that title, I just thought, yeah, beauty.
Yeah.
Because that is the theme of the book.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's lies upon lies upon lies, and people covering for one another for historic crimes. And I think that's one of the things I find really interesting is the way that you try to bring contemporary morality to bear on the sins of the past.
Well, I've kind of got to know it, Damien, because Rebus is retired, as you've pointed out, so he can't be doing contemporary stuff. He's not got a warrant card. He walks into a police station in this book and they go, "Can I help you, sir?"
Yeah.
And he goes, "Well, I worked here for 20 years. Aye. And, you know, because a young cop behind the desk has no idea who he is.
Yeah.
He's not a cop anymore. So I've really got to be going back to the stuff that he would have been involved in when he was a police officer. And I love that. I love the fact that I can be looking from the present day at the problems that we had and the issues that we had back then and the way society was very different back then.
Yeah.
And sort of shine a light on it, but also show how things have changed. And Rebus I say it in the books, he's an analogue guy in a digital world. You know what I mean? People try and explain Twitter to him. And he goes, why would anybody why would you do that? You know, and in this case, he's got kind of teenagers that he's kind of, you know, a teenage murder has happened. And so people are going, well, all the kids communicate through Snapchat and WhatsApp. And he's going, hell's that? Yeah. He's not got a clue.
He's got no clue. He's kind of stabbing away at a phone at one point when he's out on the meadows walking his wee dog Brillo. Like, what? How do you make it work?
I know.
It's absolutely brilliant.
I love that. I mean, I love the fact that he's a bit like me. He is an analogue guy in a digital world.
Oh, you're good on Twitter.
I'm all right on Twitter, but I can't do much else with a computer, buddy.
Right.
I honestly can't. I can barely put a novel together. Don't ask me to take a bit and put it there. Yeah.
So let's talk about where Rebus is at this point in his life. You said he's getting a wee bit not well. He's got COPD, hasn't he? He's sort of struggling to get up the stairs. But refusing a bungalow, because that's just the end. That's the end for him.
You know, I mean, it's one of these things.
He might end up in a bungalow.
Well, my wife said to me a few years ago, Rebus should have some issues. You know, he's had a charmed life. He smokes, he drinks, he eats fried food, he takes no exercise. Surely something's got to give. And so I gave him COPD because it's got the word cop in it. And also because it's the kind of thing that he might actually have, emphysema, as we used to call it. And as a result of that, yeah, I mean, whenever he sees a flight of stairs now, his heart sinks, almost literally. You know, he's had it for a few years now. I think the ground floor apartment might be on the cards, or the bungalow might be on the cards, because he's not going to manage 2 flights of stairs anymore. So all of that is interesting for me, but fans get worried about him. They're worried because, you know, mortality is tapping him on the shoulder more and more, as it does all of us. But there's certain people who like their detectives to be almost superhuman, to be better than the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And Rebus is fragile and frail, and all these things are coming home to roost. So soonish, I'll have to start writing a new book, and I don't know what state his health's going to be in that book. I've got a friend who's got COPD, and I phone him up every year and say, right, how's Rebus coping now? and he's the one who told me he can't go up 2 flights of stairs. He said he's going to have to move. Right. He said to me, in fact, last book, he said, is he still living in that tenement? I went, yeah. He went, 2 flights of stairs? He said, you're joking, aren't you?
So do you know where the end is for Rebus? Do you know?
It's a tough one to answer that, because as we all know, good characters never die. The author can die, but the characters might still stay. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is still with us long after his creator died and tried to kill him off in his fiction. I don't have an end point in my mind. When I start a new book, I never know if Rebus will be alive or dead at the end.
Really?
I don't know who will be alive or dead at the end of the book, and I only start to realise that in the last 2/3 of the book. So, you know, there was a possibility, not this book, but the book before, there was a possibility he could have died. Yeah. Pretty close to it. And if not him, then Cafferty, his nemesis, the gangster, his kind of alter ego, one of them could have died. But I know, and that's exciting to me. If I knew everything that was going to happen in the book, I wouldn't bother writing the book. It's because I don't know the story. When I start the first draft, I know as little as my characters. And so the first draft for me is me being detective and finding out how all these people connect to each other and what might have happened on the night in question.
Do you like any of those crime novels that are written by, you know, reimagined or recreated now? And would you let somebody do that? Would you let somebody do Rebus?
Well, I won't be around, so I won't. I mean, my son will probably go, yes, you're a beauty, if somebody's willing to, you know. But I won't be there to be bothered too much about it. You know?
But how do you feel about it, thinking about it now?
You know, I'm not precious. Right. If I'd been precious, I would never allowed it to go on television or anything, or radio dramas or stage dramas or anything. That would be my creation. But he's almost like a real person, and so he's got his own life, and he'll decide if he wants other people writing about him almost.
Okay.
And it won't be up to me. And I mean, young Rebus. You know, we've done it with Morse on television with Endeavour. There's a possibility that someone in the future could go back and do the first 10, 20 years of his professional life.
When he's in Northern Ireland?
Well, when he was in the training for the SAS, he was in the parachute regiment, he was in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, all of that. Then he joined the police, but by the time we met him in the first Rebus novel, he'd already been a cop for, I think, 10 years. So there's quite a lot of that. I couldn't write those. Those are historical novels.
One of the things that I love about the novels, as I said at the start, is that I get to see Edinburgh change. So where's Edinburgh at this point in the novel for you?
Well, you know, I think I'm getting a bit more like Rebus. I used to think I was quite liberal and nice and all the rest of it, and now I've moved into central Edinburgh. I'm going, somebody stop me buying a gun, please. You know, I mean, during the festival, oh dear God, you couldn't walk down the street. I was walking down literally the middle of the road, because that was the only place, the pavements were heaving, and the only place you could walk without bumping into folk was literally the middle of the road with cars going either way past you. And then you'd get there and you'd go, oh no, not another bloody silent disco. And there was and they're anything but silent. And I thought, honestly, if I was a bit more like Big Ger Cafferty, I would now be reaching for a gun, you know. And then as soon as that finished, we got the filming of Fast and Furious 8, whatever it is. Streets all shut off again. You know, oh no, didn't he? It's just like, what? I mean, Rebus, I mean, thank God I can channel all this stuff to Rebus. And he can deal with it.
He's like your grumpy Jekyll.
I can be, he's my Mr. Hyde. Yeah. And I can be nice and calm on the surface and just channel all those nasty thoughts to him.
What was the move like? Because you have a massive record collection, book collection. I mean, and you've moved from a big house to a small house. How did you cull them?
I mean, it took us 9 months to sort of just downsize and everything. I actually asked Adele, Ian Banks's widow. I said, "What kind of shredder did you buy to get rid of Ian's stuff?" And I got this big industrial shredder and just sat in the garage shredding a lot of VAT and tax and bank statements because I've kept everything.
That sounds criminal. That sounds like you're destroying evidence.
No, you're not. No. It's all there in the landfill.
Right,
Don't worry about
okay.
it. But no, and I just sat for about 9 months, and yeah, getting rid of a lot. Half my LPs had to go, half the CDs had to go. The charity shops of Edinburgh have never had such bounty.
Did you send them to charity shops?
Yeah, and half the books had to go. There's a big cull of the books. I was lucky that the National Library of Scotland took my manuscripts, my correspondence, contracts and stuff. So they took 26 big boxes of stuff. Otherwise, I was going to have to buy a lock-up garage because I couldn't have got rid of that. And the wee flat we're in now has no storage space at all. So it was pretty brutal, but cathartic and quite moving to go through a lot. I mean, to go through correspondence. Because I lived in France when I was a young writer, newly married, and there were letters from Ian Banks and Willie McIlvanney and Ruth Rendell and P.D. James and Reginald Hill and Colin Dexter and Philip Kerr and you name it, and they're all dead. None of them are alive now. And it's like I'm the last generation of writers who actually have a physical correspondence, a file of stuff. And it was how we used to communicate, was by letters. So going through all that was really quite moving. And Ian Crichton-Smith, was a lovely Scottish Gaelic-speaking poet and novelist and short story writer, who I got friendly with, and he came and slept on our floor in London when we lived in Tottenham and stuff like that. Letters from him from the middle of nowhere, Taynult in Scotland where he lived. And it's just it brings back memories, lots and lots and lots of memories. So that was lovely. And then I just gave it out at the National Library of Scotland and said, "You store that for me, thanks very much."
Right.
And they've got an archivist in dealing with it at the moment.
Will it be accessible in your lifetime, or have you put a ban on it?
No, it'll be accessible, but they've got to check with me if they can get in. I think that's the story. They've got to check. I don't want sort of the Sunday Post going in and going, "No, let's just get the salacious stuff." Not the Sunday Post would do that, bless them.
No, they wouldn't. They really wouldn't. It's not a Sunday Post story.
They wouldn't do the salacious stuff.
No.
But what I didn't give them was I didn't give them my diaries.
Right.
From the age of 12 till I was 32, I kept a page-a-day diary.
Really?
And those are going in my coffin. So
will there be much room for you?
Big coffin.
Big coffin?
Big coffin.
Did you really keep a page a day all the way through that time?
My sister's in the audience tonight, and she used to buy me a page-a-day diary for my Christmas every year.
Right.
And I used to feel duty-bound to fill the page, even though nothing happened to me.
Right.
And she started buying me bigger and bigger diaries, and I went, "Oh, dear God." So I would just make stuff up.
Right.
What records I would buy if I had enough money to buy records, or my top 10, or, books I would buy. But it was just in the most extraordinary detail. Took the bus to Kirkcaldy, 37p.
That's historically valuable. That is future goldmine right there. Why did you stop at 32? And not 33 or 31?
I'll tell you exactly why, because we'd moved to France and we were doing up the house we lived in because it was ramshackle, and we started to keep a house journal of doing up the house, and that became my diary for a while.
Right.
And then when we moved from there, I just didn't get back into the habit again. I use Twitter as my diary now. Twitter is my diary. I go back and I can scroll back and see what I was doing on any particular day. My tweets are every bit as enthralling as my teenage diaries.
Please join me in thanking Ian Rankin. That's great. Now it's time for some poetry. What happens to love when it's condemned as a crime? How do you find yourself in history when you've been hidden by shame? And what really happens in Soho at midnight? These are questions asked by Richard Scott in his thrilling debut collection, Soho. And he's here tonight. He's going to read a poem called Dancing Bear, which is about fathers and sons. Please welcome Richard Scott.
Dancing Bear. Children bring me coins to watch him balançoire, tomber. They imagine he has a forest inside. They close their eyes to see him foraging on a high cliff above a burnished lake, belly to the wet earth. But inside is just a savage who loves with only his claws, his wild mouth, tears at honeyed flesh with his barbed tongue. So I tamed him with a rod, a crop, my fist, starved him until he would dance this way, that way. At 6 o'clock you should see me count my money, hatfuls of brass and gold. I uncouple his snout, rub a drop of lotion in, pour myself a drink, as my father unzips his bare skin, places his naked head on my lap, throat exposed. He apologizes to me for all the places on my body his hands have scarred. But I just close his eyes, sing him to sleep, nuzzle his ears, a blade in my other hand.
Richard Scott. That is it for tonight, I'm afraid. We have done our time with crime. I thought about that for so long. I want you to join me in thanking the ladies from the Walk On Book Club in Cooper. Our lovely host here in Shira. And our guests, Chris Brookmeyer and Marissa Hatesman, aka Ambrose Parry, Sara Collins, Ian Rankin and Richard Scott. Thank you all for joining me here tonight. I will be back next time talking memoir with Rick Samada, Janice Galloway, who I always want to call Gallus Janaway, Maggie O'Farrell and Andrew McMillan. Until then, happy reading and good night. Thank you.